I gotta get rid of this cold. Hey everybody, I'm Hugh Brownstone, and welcome to this edition of Last Week Today. It's June 14th, 2015, and the big news in this past week, of course, has been the announcement by Sony of their A7R Mark II. Now, the camera's not out yet, not going to ship until August. So I'm not going to take 20 minutes or half an hour and go through all of the stuff that I really don't have answers to. Instead, 5 minutes. 5 minutes to showcase what's really important and interesting about this camera. So let's get to it. And I have notes. I'm going to refer to them. Here you go. The first thing is that Sony led with their 42 megapixel back illumination sensor. And this is really very, very smart. Because on the one hand, it steals some of the thunder from the Canon 5DS twins, the 5DS and the 5DSR, and attacks their singular strength for high megapixel count, 50 megapixels in the Canon versus 42 megapixels in the Sony. But the other thing that it does is reestablish or affirm, once again, that Sony is the leading manufacturer of imaging sensors in the world. You can find a couple of articles recently in Planet 5D where we see that Sony owns 40% of the sensor market globally. And it does so not because of simply its own cameras, but because of the sensors that find their way into cameras like the Nikon on the one hand and the iPhone 6 and iPhone 6 Plus on the other. So, very smart. And kudos to you, Sony. Kudos because, once again, you're affirming that you don't conform necessarily to conventional wisdom. And we saw that with the launch of the A7S, going all the way down to 12 megapixels in exchange for extraordinary low light sensitivity. The thing that's interesting about the A7R Mark II, though, is that this time Sony is going for the sensor trifecta: high resolution, wide dynamic range, and low noise at high ISO. That's pretty darned exciting. No other manufacturer is as clear as Sony about the need to hit on all three of these cylinders. And again, if you go back to Planet 5D, you'll see that we've done stories on this. But there's even more on the sensor front, with the option of going to Super 35 without pixel binning. So this is very interesting because without pixel binning, you're going to get less moire, and with the absence of a low-pass optical filter, you're going to get a sharper image. Now there's a little twist to that in a little bit, but let's hold that in abeyance. The Super 35 millimeter option, so basically you can get to a crop sensor camera within the Sony a7R Mark II full frame, kind of like the same thing as the Sony a6000, is that now you've got tremendous focal length flexibility. Those moderate telephotos that you already have, all of a sudden they become long distance brutes. So that's pretty cool. Okay, that's one. And this is a good thing because Sony needed to address the lens issue. And what do I mean by that? I mean that they don't have the full range of lenses that Canon or Nikon do. But actually, it's more important than just not having the full range because there are other manufacturers coming to the fore. It's really about lowering the cost of switching from Canon or Nikon to Sony. So that if they made it really easy to use those lenses on Sony, they'd have something quite extraordinary. And it's fascinating, by the way, because neither Canon nor Nikon can go the other way. You can't put Sony lenses or lenses designed for the Sony on either of those cameras. So what else have they done to make it easier to use the glass that you already have and to give you as wide a selection as possible of lenses? Well, this is where the 5-axis in-body image stabilization comes into play, and with their hybrid autofocus, phase detect autofocus, and face detection, which I have on the Sony a6000, which, by the way, is what's recording this, really, if it really works well, could cut the umbilical cord between original equipment manufacturers' bodies and lens systems. And of course, that means in this particular industry, at this particular moment in time, cutting the cord between Canon lenses and Canon bodies. If the autofocus on the A7R Mark II is not simply X% better than it was on the first generation A7, because they were pretty poor, but truly good enough so that you can actually use a Metabones adapter and get really performant autofocus, well, that's a game changer. Whoa. Because unless Canon comes out with a spectacular replacement to the 5D Mark III, or has incredibly reduced pricing, it's really kind of the end of an era for Canon. So what else is going on? The A7R Mark II has the same ergos as the A7 Mark II, which are definitely an improvement. Cool. And Sony makes a big deal about having the biggest viewfinder magnification out there for full frame. Okay, I haven't seen it, but I think we're splitting hairs, so I'm not really worried about that. When it comes to frame rates, I'm not quite sure. A couple of places have said 120 frames per second at 720p. We'll find out more about that as time goes on. It's quite possible that the Panasonic GH4 still beats the A7R Mark II for frame rates. But of course, why am I even talking about Panasonic GH4? I'm talking about the Panasonic GH4 because at the end of the day, the biggest surprise and the biggest news, and what makes this camera most interesting to me, is internal 4K recording. It makes the A7R Mark II, at least on paper, by far the best still video hybrid out there. Period. Period. That's what this is shaping up to be. Again, we have to see what it actually looks like once it's in hand. So there's a world of difference between the announcement and the actual shipping product, and as soon as we can get our hands on it, we will. But here's the thing. The A7R Mark II is a jarringly well-conceived camera. And it could leave a swath of destruction for all of its competitors. But let's talk about what competitors that means. It's not just competing against the 5D3, which, by the way, again, on paper, it blows out of the water as a hybrid. The 5D Mark III might have better autofocus. It might have higher frame rate, although that is in still mode. 5 frames per second is what the Sony a7R Mark II is reported to have. I don't need more about that. Your mileage may vary. But it also is not just a competitor to the other mirrorless cameras there, the Panasonic GH4, the Samsung NX1, or Canon's just announced XC10. It looks like the A7R Mark II outpoints all of the cameras I've just mentioned by a lot. So much so that it may actually be worth the $3,200 that Sony is going to charge when it starts shipping in August. And by the way, for that same amount of money, you could get 5, maybe even 6 Sony a6000 bodies. So it depends on what you want to do. But I'm excited. All right? Got to be getting close to 5 minutes. Here's the thing that I haven't heard anyone talk about. At $3,200 with these specs, the A7R Mark II is going to cause heads to swivel for people considering cameras all the way up to the Canon C300 Mark II, which is the first interchangeable lens camera you can get into the Canon line with 4K. Now, by the way, internal 4K recording on the Sony a7R Mark II, probably 8-bit, and I'm not quite clear if the output, the clean HDMI output, is 10-bit, but if it's 10-bit, whoa, that really creates problems for Panasonic GH4. Now, the GH4 is less than half the price, but the sensor performance of the A7R Mark II, even in video mode, is likely to blow away the GH4. And the A7R Mark II may cause problems for Sony's own FS7. And the guys over at Blackmagic, they can't be that happy either, because it's quite likely to give the Ursa Mini, a camera which looks really, really interesting to me, a real run for their money. Okay, got to be close to 5 minutes, right? Hugh Brownstone, see you next time.